Adam, thanks so much for joining for our conversation today for the We Rise podcast. I'm so excited to talk with you. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself in a minute, Adam Wells, but would love to just hear a little bit about yourself and how you're engaged in community and work. And thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, well, Christine, thanks so much. It's such an honor to be a part of this in the big way. And it's just such a cool thing to be, have watched your journey through to get to this point and be a part of your journey to, publish this work. And thanks for letting me be a part of it.
I'm delighted that you're a part of it. You're a big part of it. So thank you.
Yeah, cool. So about me, I have to talk about me now.
A little bit about you. Just what's making you tick these days in February of 2021 with all the things happening in the world?
Yeah, the sunshine's making me tick lately.
For sure.
Yeah, I can see the grass in my yard, and that's nice. I'll start with my family. My family makes me tick. So we live in Wise County, Virginia, in the far southwest corner. My wife and I have two small children. Sawyer's 5 and Ruby's 2. So we've been home together most of the pandemic. We got them back in daycare at the beginning of this year. It's been off and on with the weather, and just had another COVID closure. So that's, I guess we'll probably talk more about that as we talk about resilience. So that's like a lot of my world at home. For work, I am the Regional Director of Community and Economic Development for Appalachian Voices, based in our Norton, Virginia office. So in that role, I oversee our New Economy program, as well as our Central Appalachian program. The New Economy works on economic and community redevelopment opportunities, and the Central Appalachian program works to mitigate the impacts of negative economic and social and environmental impacts of the coal industry. So both those programs are based out of our Norton office. I've been with App Voices. I started in I just had a birthday. It was February 15th, 2015 was my first day.
Awesome.
So I guess I went 6 years now.
Okay.
But before that, I went to undergrad at Appalachian State, where Appalachian Voices is kind of, the mothership office. And I showed up. I really did show up for the free pizza as, like a student volunteer.
That's awesome.
Yeah, true story.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So an arc of the mothership, I love that about Voices. To hear you are in Southwest Virginia, and you talk a little bit about, your family and your kids. And I know we'll dive into, your work in Central Appalachia, but how are your kiddos doing? How are they holding up in all this? What's it been like to be home for them and from their perspective, do you think? Or glimpses are you getting into their worlds?
Yeah. So Ruby she's 2 now. So she was just barely 1 when it all started. And I don't think she probably remembers the before times.
Before times, I love that.
Yeah. And so, I think it was fine on her. Sawyer's a wonderful older brother. He takes the job very seriously. And she just kind of leaned on him during, when we were home all last year. So I don't think it was too hard on her. Sawyer is at a point where, hanging out with friends really mattered. And I think, he started making up stories about stuff that he did with his friends that might have never happened. Yeah. And so it was just really clear he was hurting more from having that loss of connection on a regular basis. That's one of the things that made us just suck it up and send them into school, even though there's no vaccine here yet. Was just the need for them to have socialization far outweighed the risk of getting or transmitting COVID, and it was just so obvious that they needed that for their development, especially Sawyer at that age.
Yeah. So interesting how our littles, we have a 10 and 13-year-old as well, had the Just mirror our own needs as well for connection and community. And in the absence of that, we find a way to make it up or make it happen.
They are such little mirrors, aren't they?
Yeah.
Except one of your littles is taller than you now, right?
Yes, which is no longer surprising. It was
Yeah.
surprising for a little while, and now it's something that is wild to see.
Mhm.
Yeah, our son grow and change. So
Yeah. One thing I noticed, oh, as my wife and I struggled, because Emily, my wife, works full time as well, so we're both at home full time with the kids, and they really are just little mirrors. Like if we were having a bad day, like there would be like almost instantly, just not splendid behavior is what we call it.
I love that.
Yeah, and so like in a time when everything was just so intense, sometimes like they would be, it wasn't like I was, I'm feeling unwell right now. It was like, oh, my kids are acting up. I must be being a jackass.
I love it.
And
Straight up honesty.
yeah, and it's so they're a great service they were providing without even knowing it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So there's indicators and barometers.
Hmm.
So as we move through our conversation, moving from the community level or even regional level, the home level, it's where it all starts, at our own self and our own home. So I invite you to weave in the stories of your own family and community, whatever way makes sense. But I do think that the indicator of our family as a barometer is such a great marker about how do we know when things are well and unwell. I recently heard someone talk about illness versus wellness and the I versus the we difference between them. And I love that. And what's that, what are those markers of wellness? So when you do broaden your view out a little bit, Adam, and think at the community scale, what have been some of the things that have built community wellness, have built community strength, have built community togetherness in Southwest Virginia or town level, regional level?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's well, I guess I should say a little bit about like paint the picture of Southwest Virginia for
Yeah.
folks listening,
Yeah.
and where I'm at in Southwest Virginia. So Wise County is kind of in the center of what is commonly called far Southwest Virginia, which is also the historic coal mining region. There's 7 counties that make up what's normally called far Southwest Virginia, and Wise is kind of right in the middle on the border with Kentucky. Um, and so there's a spectrum of communities from pretty larger towns that are on major highways that are like the town of Wise where I live. It's got the University of Virginia's College at Wise, and then smaller like what were coal camp communities kind of up in the hollers, and kind of deeper into the mountains. That are at this point less populated and still don't have as easy access by road, and sometimes access to broadband or other services. So it's not a monolith. That's one thing that I want people to know, is that there's pockets where you can go and find stuff that would be distressing, and there's pockets where you go and it's like, oh my gosh, this place is on fire. Why don't we live here right now? Um, and that can change depending on the season and many other factors. So I think like there's one of the things, if you look around, like the city of Norton where our office is one area that's doing really well. It's located at the crossroads of some major highways, which has helped. I think that when thinking about resilience, like there's this baseline of like access to resources, access to privilege, access to internal resources, and then outside resources. And one thing I've noticed is that the communities that have done a good job of bringing in those outside resources were already in a position, they weren't super hard up to begin with. Like Norton, for example, had that tremendous benefit of being at the crossroads of the major intersections. St. Paul is another community That's right on the beautiful Clinch River, where there's been a lot of wonderful work that's happened. And St. Paul, it's in the coal fields, but it's also right on the edge of the coal fields. So I think that's another thing is, proximity to the edge. I think that can make a difference as well. Am I answering your question? Do you want to ask
You
another
sure
one?
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're talking about, what are the things that are helping to make Southwest Virginia have inklings of resilience and connection infrastructure? It sounds like are
Mhm.
some of the things that are important. Um, so before we dive more into, your work in Southwest Virginia and broader Central Appalachia, drawing those connections, whether it's in your own personal infrastructure, if you will,
Mhm.
or connections in your life, tell us a little bit more about your story, Adam, and what have been some points of, where's some points of learning or some points of resilience or some points, what are ways, so that part of the whole theme of the podcast is stories of resilience and transformation. And, I know your story kind of well, my story kind of well, but
Mhm.
what are some things that have been real defining points for you in your circle around the sun here in terms of growing your own resilience in your
Mhm.
own life? And then, we'll kind of go back out to the community level.
Sure. Um, it's always got to decide where to start on your personal story, right?
Sure, I know.
Yeah.
How much to share?
Um, so my family on my dad's side has been in Wise County since the late 1700s. My mom's from kind of the bluegrass region of Kentucky. They met in school. So dad went off to school. He went to Kentucky for school where he met mom, and he never came back. So I was the first generation from my dad's side that wasn't born here. And he left during one of the coal crashes. And, at that point, it was either, be a kind of a poor coal miner at that point. That was it. There was very few opportunity. And so he thought, the obvious choice to have a family was to get out of here. And so he did. And we moved all around kind of the Southeast growing up. He did environmental and safety stuff at chemical plants. And so we just bopped around to different chemical plant communities. Not as nasty as it sounds. um, and but we'd always come back to here growing up and visit my grandparents who lived on the family homestead where the log cabin still is, that great whoever made with their hands. Up on the hillside above that is the family cemetery where all my people are buried. So in kind of this transience growing up, I had this really strong anchor point of place that happened to be beautiful, that where mountains and hills and forests where I could run around and be a little wild person and kind of live my, which is my full, like that's my destiny. Like that's run through the woods. So I always like from very early like couldn't understand why we didn't live here and wanted to get back as fast as I could. So when I finished school at Appalachian State, I did. I moved back, lived in grandma's basement at first, and then there's a house on the family farm that nobody was living in that they let me, the family corporation, which folks that know what that is will know what I'm talking about, let me live in, and yeah, started working. When I first moved back here, I was working for the Southern Appalachian Mountain Stewards, which is a small community organization that's still around 15 years later, that was fighting mountaintop removal. And it was, primarily made up of folks living in coal communities with, mountaintop removal sites literally in their backyards. So that was really started out as an environmental justice organizer. And over the course of my career, kind of follow the arc of the movement in Appalachia. I'm wired more towards solutions. I prefer to be doing that kind of work. And as coal declined, the need to be doing more economic and community development solutions-based work got, possible and very needed. And so when there's this opportunity to start working in this line of work in 2015, I jumped at the opportunity.
Awesome. Do you find that many folks in your upbringing through activism work and working on solutions-based work, is that a common lens that you find folks take, or one that folks are amenable to, or take to readily?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think that, I can only say about my experience, which is very much in Appalachia, and the kind of the peers that I, kind of came of organizing age with. And it seemed like there was kind of this collective tendency towards, wanting to work on solutions-based work. There's been, it's sometimes very, very vocal elements of people that, say, well, we can't forget what we're fighting, and we can't, it's really, there's still plenty of environmental injustice, and there's, still stuff in people's backyards that is, imminently dangerous today, that's unjust and should be opposed and resisted. But yeah, I think that it seems that way, but that's just my perspective, and that's like what I'm doing. So of course it's what I'm going to see. So I wouldn't want to say like that's the way it is, but it's certainly the way it looks from my perspective.
Makes sense. It does seem like more of the organizations I'm aware of do take a solutions oriented focus, and there's a real tension there between, sometimes people call it stopping the bad versus working on the good, focusing on the positive. And it is a tension. It is a tension that exists, and something I know many folks wrestle with. So when you look out more broadly at them over Central Appalachia, what are you seeing happen? Like when you started organizing 15 years ago, it sounds like we're kind of really working on environmental injustice and working with folks. And what are you seeing some like bigger trends in Central Appalachia? You're really working with everyday community members. You're also working at, with organizations changing policy. You're working at regional scales to create change. So you have a lot of different levels of view from, how everyday folks are trying to put food on the table and what that looks like, and the very real challenges, especially exacerbated by COVID, and people's health and safety, on the line in every way. But you also, are working on some long-ranging vision and projects. So what kinds of things are you seeing in Central Appalachia? I wouldn't say trends necessarily, but what are you seeing that's happening in Central Appalachia to grow resilience, or where are you seeing points of strength as well in Central Appalachia?
The biggest, I think this is like a pretty, I can make this a pretty blanket statement, is that by and large, the region as a whole has come to terms with the fact that, coal has declined in a way that it'll never recover from. So like, was a huge crisis point when it was happening. I think that most people, both at, leadership level and like community economic development professional level, as well as, folks down the street, have, come to understand like it's not coming back. We can't look to coal to be what it used to be in our lives and in our economy, in our culture. And so like from there, we can start building something new. And I think, that looking back now, and, for outsiders just observing, like, it seems totally obvious that, non-renewable source of energy would run out one day and we'd have to figure out something else. But it's been a huge, long road to get here. And there's been just a lot of resistance, kind of up until the point where it was just painfully obvious. Like, that's what it took becoming painfully obvious that we were never going back to start looking forward as a whole. And so from that, I think really in the last 5 years, there's been just this wonderful blooming of collaboration across, like, political spectrum doesn't really matter here. People in communities are working together within their community, and then, within communities and state, and then across states, to take advantage of, like, the situation that we have, which is an opportunity to make something new. I think there's a shared sense of urgency, both that, like, we got to act now if we want our children to be able to live here and, have a living that's good. And that, there's a lot of attention on Appalachia right now. There's, quite a bit of federal and state resources that are being directed towards the region for economic redevelopment that probably won't last forever. And so we've got this, kind of one shot to figure out how to make a new Appalachia, new economy. And we got to do it together. I think there's a really shared sense, and that's the strength, is that, and that wasn't there before, because there wasn't that shared understanding of just how critical of a moment that we're in.
Yeah. So some really interesting themes there around the reckoning of the pain of the past, knowing that coal isn't going to put food on the table in the same way today that it has before, and also a sense of urgency of, we need to really look at this moment and see what is going to allow things to really shift in a bigger, more sustained way. What was that reckoning like, do you feel like, for people, knowing that's going to be really different for each family and each company? But do you feel like it takes the pain, recognizing the pain and looking at it and kind of acknowledging the pain to be able to move from it to something else? It's a big question, but one of the things that I've really been noticing is the communities that are the most successful in transitioning to something else have been able to hold that pain or look at the pain and say, this is really hard. But when communities seem to be stuck in the past of the way things were, then they're often not able to move on to what comes next. And that middle ground, that chaotic, challenging time, is often the seedbed of where new ideas can go. But I do think it takes a sense of belonging and a sense of community to feel safe enough to be able to wrestle with that pain of loss, because it is a real pain, a heartache for people. Does that resonate at all, or have you noticed that with communities? What has that looked like in your experience or in your lens?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think it's important to point out here is that, like, when we're talking about coal communities transitioning, the ones that, like, the effective efforts have really, like, haven't just said, well, coal sucks, it brought us to this terrible place and forget coal. No one's saying that. That's doing good work. I think the successful efforts really embrace there's a really proud history of coal mining, and, like, the hard work of coal miners and coal mining families, the role that women have played in coal mining and union organizing, and, like, that's awesome. And that the same strength that allowed our region to thrive at that, can help us in the future, and it's worth, it should be lifted up. And that's a part of our story, and shouldn't be abandoned just because the economics of the coal industry have shifted. So that's really important. And I think people that aren't from here or haven't spent a lot of time here just can't understand that in a way that without listening really hard, because there's some seeming there's seemingly oppositional threads there. So that's one thing. If we look at, like, take the community of St. Paul, for example, that has been doing transition planning for over 20 years now. So that they were doing it before it was cool, before it was really an okay thing to do out in the open. And that's why you walk downtown St. Paul and you can go get, a craft beer that was made right there on site. You can't do that anywhere else in the coal fields in Virginia that I know of. Not that like being able to get craft beer is like the only metric of resilience.
But it is one that people talk about a whole lot.
Yeah, I have another one, which is, can I go get a sandwich with sprouts on it?
Yeah. I wonder how many people have that metric. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Mountain Rose Vineyard in Wise is the only restaurant that I know that does serve sprouts on a quinoa salad. Actually, just make a little plug for my neighbor there.
On a former mine site.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think that you can find a few examples of communities. St. Paul's a good one. Dungannon is another good one, where there was leadership. Super, it does not happen accidentally. It happens because of brave leadership and of people, and it's usually women telling people the truth about what's going to happen and like why we got to get together and act in the best interest of the community.
Love that.
Yeah, I think there's a few examples where that has happened, where it hasn't had the threat of pain was enough to inspire action, not the experience of pain. But I would say overall, as a region, it really did take that collapse kind of in the early 2010s to create a safe place to talk about transition. And I mean, I wouldn't say that it's like entirely safe still. I don't see, like, when I look at the regional discourse of community development, economic development, it still feels pretty mainstream to me. And I don't think that within the kind of the core of the discussion that we're doing a good enough job of bringing in voices from the margins. And I think, that's where creativity happens. That's where real change happens so often. And I think there's this tendency to want this clean narrative of, well, we got knocked down, we're going to dust ourselves off and, we'll build data centers until everybody's got a job. And I think it's just, the truth is that it's going to be a lot more messy than that. And I think if we really want a resilient transition that sticks and works, I think that we've got to do a better job of leaning into the messier parts of economic and community development and bringing in voices that haven't been at the table and asking, why haven't they been at the table? And this isn't this is a criticism. If this is anyone's job to do, it's my job. So this is a criticism of myself more than any particular person or organization. Because I think one of the Appalachian Voices great strengths is that we're small enough to be nimble and take those risks, but we're well resourced enough also to be able to absorb when those risks might backfire a little bit or go a way we didn't hope they did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So really interesting themes, and owning it. I heard that owning it, that was really appreciated that you brought it back to how change does happen at the individual level and grows out from there, kind of a concentric rings. You also touched on a really interesting thread of safety. You mentioned that it took collapse and that reckoning, I think is the word that you used, to create a sense of safety, but it's not at the mainstream yet. And you talked about leaning into the messy parts. Can you talk a little bit more, Adam, about what has allowed safety, like in that collapse? What are some things that allowed safety for people to talk with each other, or where they felt like it was okay to lean into those messy parts? Why were people willing to lean into messy parts where you've seen those points of transition have like glimmers of like, oh, what are they up to? I want to know what they're doing.
Well, the kind of I guess the elephant in the room was, for a long time, was that you couldn't talk about, a post-coal economy in Appalachia if you were an elected official or, somebody in a public position. Without risking your next election or your job or being against coal. And so like the first safety was that like when the collapse became so obvious, like there was this kind of collective reckoning that like, well, yeah, this has happened and here it is, like you just can't ignore it anymore. And it just seemed, like telling that story now, it just seems so obvious, but it was like you couldn't do it. Like there's a reason why we weren't doing transition work the way that we are now 8 years ago. Like just it wasn't possible while coal was still in a boom cycle. Am I answering your question? I feel like there's two questions here. I haven't answered.
Well, it sounds like while coal was really a still key driver of the economy, it wasn't really possible to talk about what would post-coal look like because the everyday experience was still that coal was really driving the economy.
And there's this identity. I think that's there's an identity where coal mining region, like everybody, then everyone knew someone who was working in a coal mine. It could have been somebody, at your supper table, could have been somebody down the road. So it was, and there's, for a good reason, a strong identity with like, the pride that comes with working hard and making good money as a coal miner. And so speaking, what negatively about coal in a community that is so close knit, in so many ways, and where there's just a lot of, very like familial relation connections. You ran the risk of like, saying something bad about like your cousin or your brother's nephew, or whatever. And so I think that's one of the great strengths of our region is that, I think like you look at West Virginia, why is West Virginia winning in COVID vaccines? It's because they're so darn connected. And that's why a COVID hotline is working to get West Virginia vaccinated, because there's just such a close-knit community there. But that closeness, I think when folks don't want to hurt each other or don't want to run the risk of hurting one another, it can keep necessary conversations from happening. And I think there's just a lot of, in Appalachia, a long history of kind of sweeping that stuff under the rug. And I think that was just applied at, just massive level when it came to talking about coal.
That's interesting. So people's connections and their care for one another and desire to not hurt one another, keep each other safe on one level, it sounds like also had the effect of not looking at maybe what's coming down the road in the future and what are some challenges. And it's hard to have those conversations about what the future might look like, especially when there's so much unknown. So we talked a little bit about what it takes for folks to feel safe with each other and looking at the future. And one of the reasons it was has been hard for people to talk about coal and the future of communities is that they want to protect each other because there's a strong sense of connection and care and community, which is important and strong. And a lot of regions across the United States don't have that anymore. Don't have that sense of connection. But it can sometimes hold people back when we're trying to protect each other from doing the hard work of looking at the future and what the future looks like. So maybe that's a point of challenge, maybe not. When you do look across the region or even locally, what do you feel like are places that have held the region back from growing resilience, from being able to work towards solutions, from getting sprouts or a craft beer? I wouldn't necessarily use those metrics across the board because it is going to look different in different places, but where has the community been held back from growing resilience?
Yeah. When I look out and look at the communities that are struggling the most to just to survive, and there are some towns that are on the verge of losing like their town charter because they can't generate enough tax revenue to pick up the garbage and get people clean water. Those are towns that had, so it started with having the most taken from them, right? Those were like the towns in the heart of coal mining country that kind of the center of extraction. I think that's an important starting point. And from there, most of those towns have seen, kind of a steady decline because they were the most reliant on extraction, and as extraction declined, and so did their local base, taxes and people and all sorts of resources. And then which I think a community can recover from those things, but what I've seen is that those towns have the hardest time attracting and retaining leaders, particularly elected leaders or civil leaders. And so there's a handful of towns in the region that are really struggling, and that they can't afford to pay a full-time town manager. And if we're looking at a position like at a place where the towns that are doing well are the ones that are that are getting outside grant dollars and investments to come in, like that's kind of and they're meeting the community's vision with outside resources to go someplace new. Bringing in those resources is it's a critical function of local government. And if there's not a functioning local government, then those resources don't come in, and it continues to spiral downward. And it's not that leadership in any one of these towns isn't trying hard. I know they're trying their damnedest to keep their community together. But when the starting line for them was so much further back than the communities like Norton, like St. Paul, that are on the edges or have access to that infrastructure, then it really does become kind of a crisis of leadership, but not necessarily a crisis of leadership that's leadership's fault. It's just like hard to make soup out of rocks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what has helped even the playing field in your mind, or help get communities to a similar starting line? What's really crucial to make that happen?
Yeah. Well, one thing is, so I've been talking a lot about elected leaders, but the community of Ditt is a good example as an outlier where the Ditt is it's in Russell County, in the coal fields, and was the heart of the Clinchfield coal mining company back in the 40s and 50s. So very center of extraction. But Ditt has the Ditt Community Association, which is a group of people that live there, mostly grandmas, who have gotten together, that have attracted a few young folks that have energy and inspiration, and have articulated a vision for their community that starts from where they're at, as like that the proud history of being the center of the Clinchfield coal mining company, and goes out into the assets that they have around them, which are beautiful mountains and trails, and that history. And so I think to answer your question, it's gritty grandmas can help
I
level the
love
playing field.
it.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
in so many of, in my experience working in Appalachia, so many times it's grandmas that just like go out there and pound the pavement and get their neighbors together and are, actually the ones that are really in charge. Um,
Love it.
yeah. And where there's a band of gritty grandmas with a vision, like you usually see good stuff happening. And Daint is a really good example of where all that comes together. One really cool corollary or thing happening with the Daint situation is Daint's about 15 minutes into the mountains from St. Paul, and so they've really been able to capture that energy and just vitality and resources and leadership as well that's coming from St. Paul and attract that into Daint. And so I think
Mm,
that's really, if you look at the like healing starts at the edges and works its way in.
mm.
If we say that St. Paul's done a good job and now they're passing that on to Daint, um, one bit of anecdotal evidence to support that theory of change. Um,
Love that.
yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a beautiful, healing at the edges and work your way in, which is the way, if you look at a wound,
Mhm.
that healing does physically take place as well. So
Right.
really beautiful analogy. And St. Paul and Dane are a great example of certainly community leaders helping each other out very directly, connecting to resources, telling stories. Oh, you should talk to so and so. So I heard a little bit of quickening in your voice and talking about Date. What else? What makes you excited, Adam, when you look out across the Norton, Wise, Southwest Virginia, or beyond? What makes you excited to get up in the morning?
Hmm. Um, yeah, I mean, I love making projects happen. I love figuring out the puzzle pieces. And Daint is just an example of where many pieces have come together and like you can start to see like, what is this a puzzle of?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it really is. It's what gets me out of bed in the morning is thinking about how we connect the very um, the deeply informed community vision that comes from Southwest Virginia, from people living here, with each other, with other communities, outside, within Appalachia, across the mountain into Kentucky, up into West Virginia, over in Ohio. There's just so much that we can learn from our neighbors, from our Appalachian neighbors that are doing this too. And then, so building that narrative, building that vision, and then resourcing that, both with energy and people from within, and then with money from federal and state grant sources, from philanthropy, because it won't happen without those grant dollars.
Adam, you're talking about the importance of having a vision, a strong vision, and then connecting it with resources, federal, state, philanthropy. What else is important? What else would you say is important to make that vision a reality? And
Mhm.
what else have you seen to help grow those visions into realities across Appalachia?
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, one of the lessons that I have learned and that we've learned with Appalachian Voices New Economy program is we kind of started out thinking that we'll play this role as like a bridge between the good ideas on the ground and the resources needed to make them happen. And I had a little chart with a bridge that I used at like staff retreat presentations.
I love it.
Yeah. And but then once we started actually like helping like get money to these projects, we realized that it's not enough just to be a bridge. There's got to be ongoing support once the resources arrive, because in many cases, communities aren't set up to manage like $100,000 grant, certainly not $1 million grant. And even if like the county government is involved, they're already severely under-resourced. And so, a cool community redevelopment project might not be their top priority to invest their administrative capacity on. So there's kind of like, there's two approaches there. One is like, as an organization that helps get money to ideas, like we've got to have a long-term commitment to an idea and to a community to say like, we're with you through the implementation of this, and we're going to help with like the boring, nasty parts of, dealing with federal reporting on grants. It like is totally, that keeps me in bed. Think of
Right.
it. Yeah. Yeah. But at the same time, like we don't want to just be doing that forever. Like we need to set up so that there is infrastructure that like, there's not a reliance on, an outside entity at the same level forever. We want to build community capacity to be doing that. That's hard because again, like it takes paying people for their time to do that kind of stuff. And it's just not a lot of money for those kinds of softer expenses, as they're called in grant world. And I think that's really one of the biggest challenges that I see out there. Is there's been a flood of, there's been millions, if not billions of dollars directed towards Appalachia in the last 3 years for economic development. But very little investment has gone towards the infrastructure to properly plan and spend that money. And in some cases we'll get lucky. That money will go to projects that are just, that are well thought out, that have long-term viability plans. But in other cases, that money's going to go to complete bullshit and make a bad name for the region and for that particular funding program. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges kind of in the community economic development space right now, is to make sure that there's that capacity to spend the money thoughtfully and well, and make sure that there's capacity on the ground, that we're not just dumping piles of money and then leaving. We've got a joke. It's called the bags of money test. And if flying over a community in a helicopter and dropping bags of money would be more impactful than your grant, then your grant's a bad idea.
Okay, there you go. Right. Yep. Pretty straightforward there. Pretty direct. Yeah, absolutely. So to just tease out two of the things you've mentioned, you've talked about earlier, you mentioned bringing voices in from the margins, and that those voices really need to be centered more. Yeah. And you just mentioned the word just. What does that transition look like? Can you say a little bit more about what it takes to bring voices in from the margin in a way that is real and meaningful and deep? And then what do you mean by just? Can you say a little bit more about that and how it relates to capacity and building capacity, if there is a connection there? So two different questions. I'm happy to circle back to them. And I know that they're trickier ones, but
say the best for last.
Yeah.
Which do you want to start with?
How do you, Adam, bring in, you talked about bringing in voices from the margins. How do you do that in a way that is meaningful and deep and lasting?
Yeah. I'll tell you how we do it, which is we create lots of opportunities to meet people where they're at. Like physically, temporally, like not everyone's going to want to join a conference call at 3:00. Folks that work can't. So really making an effort to have, when we're having community meetings, we have them in the evening in the community center that people can have a short drive to, or just walk down the street to. So we go to where folks are at when they're there. And within our program, like we really prioritize just shutting up and listening, asking questions, but really doing our best to not, to check our agenda, or when we have one, make it clear, and just really, really deeply listen and listen for a long time. Not, there's like listening to check the box, and there's listening because of the deep wisdom that you get from listening. And so we strive for the latter. But then there's got to be, that sort of work's been happening for a long time in Appalachia. There's been a lot of good meaning folks showing up in communities for decades. And I think most people are wise to that, especially those gritty grandmas we were talking about earlier. So there's got to be, meaningful avenues, places where that energy is directed towards something that is winnable, that can be felt in the community, and that is aligned with, what we're hearing in the community, and is, immediately responsive to those expressed needs that we've heard. And then what we do at Appalachian Voices is we work to do that listening, deep and sometimes intimate spaces on the front porch, in people's living rooms, at community centers, and then as it's appropriate and as people are okay with it, put that out for the world to see and for the world to know, whether that's in blogs or stories in our newspaper, or submitting comments to whatever thing needs a comment made.
Yeah.
So I think there's got to be that deep listening. It's got to be responsive to like a need. The impact has to be felt in the community, and there has to be like a very visible and real place that energy is being directed towards. Otherwise, like, it's just tokenism. That's the danger of falling short.
Yeah. Beautiful. So deep listening. So as we get ready to wrap up our conversation today, Adam, when you think about the term just, what does that mean for you? Whether that's a transition or whether that's just the future of a community, what does that look like? You did mention building capacity.
Mm-hmm.
How is that connected?
Yeah. So just transition is a term that gets thrown around a lot. My definition of that is that the people that gave the most to get us to where we're at now, in the energy world, particularly in Appalachia, those communities and workers, people should be among the first to benefit from the new economy that we're creating. So the ones that gave the most should be the first to get the benefits of the new. But that won't happen on its own. There has to be very thoughtful and targeted interventions to make sure that happens. Otherwise, business as usual will continue. So I guess to expand that out, like, justice is about an intervention and about breaking the cycles of injustice that have been, allowed to go on for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you think about where you are now and how much you've grown, and I've seen you grow in the years, what do you wish someone had told you, Adam, 5 or 10 years ago about this work? What would you share out to others, either other lessons learned or other ideas? What do you think is important for folks to know about this work?
Yeah, well, people told me, so I didn't listen. I think I've probably been told everything I need to be told already. It's just a matter of listening and then doing it.
I love it.
No, it's around boundaries. I think that, personally, I want to make people happy. I'm, tend towards the people pleasing spectrum. And so in doing that, I sacrifice my own personal boundaries. And if I do that enough, it undermines my ability to show up with the light in the world that I want to. And so really, like, and this has, been exacerbated, and just not exacerbated, but the great importance of this has just been highlighted through COVID, of just the need for, like, how holding boundaries is showing love to yourself and to the folks around you. And so, like, personally, like, I'm on this journey of really figuring out how to integrate that into, like, myself, kind of me and, my alone time first, and then how to, like, once I get better at that, like, how do I bring that to my work? Because if you let it, the work takes you over.
So self-care,
Mhm.
boundaries, self-care, taking care of yourself, making sure you're filling your own cup up.
Yeah, I think about, you told me that once, that I think
Yeah.
that, yeah, you got to fill your cup first and then let the overflowings overflow.
Yeah. Lisa Nichols talks about giving from the overflow into the saucer to
Yeah.
others rather than from your own cup,
Mhm.
which is such a beautiful analogy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think about that. You shared that with me like a year ago, and I've thought about that over the past year.
Yeah. Yeah. I've thought about it a lot too. So Adam, so beautiful and poignant what you shared today. I really appreciate your time. Is there anything else you'd like for folks to know about your work or the region before we wrap up today? Anything else you'd like to share out?
Oh, there's a lot, but speaking of boundaries, I got to go.
Gotta go.
Yeah. Yeah. But Christine, I'm just so honored to be a part of this, part of your We Rise project. And thanks for having me. It's been great talking to you. And I just wish you the best of luck on the effort. And I know that it's going to be successful. Just tickled to see it happen.
Awesome. Well, you're a big part of it, and I really appreciate your time today. I hope you have a great rest of the day. And thanks, Adam. Take
Okay,
care.
thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Take care. Bye.